Almost every person has gone through a moment of crisis in their life. This can include things such as a bad breakup, a divorce, a loss of a job, or even a death in the family. However, in all those circumstances, we often find it's not what happens to people that defines them, but how they react to those adverse situations that ultimately defines them. In today's book, Upheaval by Jared Dimond, we find that countries are also very similar to people. And when they face moments of crises, it's ultimately how they react to those crises that makes them who they are today. One example was the surrender of Singapore by the British in World War II, and the effect it had on Australia having to realize its own sovereign identity. Prior to that event, Australians always thought of themselves as an extension of the British Empire and not as an independent country. When Britain declared war on a country, Australia always declared war on the same country in lockstep. Australia also sent volunteer troops to England's defense, even if it meant sending them 10,000 miles away to do so. For instance, one of Australia's biggest holidays to this day is Anzac Day, which commemorates the day that nearly 9,000 volunteer Australian troops lost their lives in the Battle of Gallipoli in World War I. Keep in mind, all of those troops lost their lives nearly 8,000 miles away from their home. However, Australia's undying devotion to Britain all changed in World War II, when Britain, after having promised to protect Australia from Japan, abandoned its Singapore base on February 15, 1942. Australia was ultimately left vulnerable to a Japanese offensive, having already sent many of their own troops to England to help with their war effort. As a result of the abandonment of the Singapore base, it was the first time in Australia's history that they had to defend their own home without the help of their motherland, that they would have to fight for the survival of themselves. To give you guys an idea of how much the abandonment stung Australia, over 50 years later, Prime Minister Paul Keating mentioned it in his speech to Parliament.
I learned one thing. I learned about self-respect and self-regard for Australia. Not about some cultural cringe to a country which decided not to defend the Malaysian Peninsula, not to worry about Singapore, not to give us our troops back to keep ourselves free from Japanese domination.
I'm sure a lot of you guys can relate to Australia's relationship with England. You give everything to someone else, wrap your whole identity in that other person, only for them to betray your trust. It was at that moment that Australia had to ask themselves a really important question, which is, who are we? Who are we without England? What makes us Australians? And that is when Australia had to start creating its own identity. With Australia's newfound identity, they tried to redefine themselves past their previous British relationship. Previously, Australia had a very stringent policy against immigration from countries that were non-white, despite being surrounded by only non-white countries. However, slowly, Australia allowed immigrants from surrounding countries. And by 1991, nearly half of all immigrants were from Asian countries. Another example illustrated in the book was the beginning of the Meiji Empire in Japan. Prior to the 1850s, Japan was an extremely isolated country that still had strong feudalism and a shogunate. However, that all changed in 1854 when Commodore Perry of America forced them to open up their country and accept unfavorable trade treaties with Western countries. The humiliating event made Japan realize that they can no longer remain isolated from the rest of the world, and they needed to open themselves up to new ideas and technologies in order to make themselves powerful enough not to be bullied by Western countries. Japan sent delegations all over the world to learn about Western customs and weapons, and began their transition to the modern country that we know Japan today as. As a side note, if any of you guys are fans of anime, then a great anime from this time period is called Samurai X, which follows an ex-samurai named Kenshin as he tries to navigate his life in a now modernizing Japan. These are just two examples in the book that Jared Dimond covers, but there are several other stories. Overall, I would say the book is pretty decent, and I really enjoyed the fact that he covered non-traditionally Western countries such as Chile, Japan, and Indonesia. However, the book doesn't have a very strong narrative structure with characters and storytelling that most popular books like this use to make the content more enjoyable to read. This can make it feel like you're reading an actual history textbook at times. Overall, I'd give this book 3.5 stars out of 5. In terms of the information and knowledge that you gain from this book, it's absolutely fantastic. but the book is just simply not very readable and can get a little dull at times. Well, that's my review. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and tune in next time for another review on beer, politics, and books.